What is a country? There are different ways to answer this question. Even the answer itself is shaping people's sense of identity in different countries. A very popular idea at the moment is the denial of historical heritage and the importance of the concept of the state. Emphasizing individual identity is the only source of legitimacy. The state, in this national narrative, past is nothing but worthless historical baggage. It's what prevents a person from finding their true self. This dislike of the country and its national history follows the latest trends. Complaints about the so-called family of origin share the same logic. It seems that all the misfortunes that happen to a person, all setbacks, come from past achievements and from rotten elders who do not understand power. He seduced a man to abandon all blood, geocultural relations, and rush into the exotic land that seems to symbolize the new birth. Apparently, this national narrative is extremely beneficial to the world order shaped by the United States today. But when we look at the United States, we find that Americans have a deep understanding of their founding history and take a very different attitude. For a long time, the founding fathers of the United States have enjoyed high prestige in American culture. The text they left behind is read by people like the Bible and heralded as the eternal truth of statecraft. This pilgrimage attitude, in turn, made the early history of the United States full of mysterious creation and unrealistic beautification. Countless intellectuals took this history and portrayed it as a group of idealists with the firm belief that all men are created equal to establish a hierarchy without division, where everyone can succeed through personal struggle. Although black slaves in America's wealthy families might disagree with this description, in the eyes of these intellectuals, the opinion of these uneducated people was not important. Or this little flaw, compared to the later great achievements of the United States, is negligible. However, this is just a modern myth woven by future generations. Recorded with historical records like Gaozu Liu Bang slaying white snakes drunk in Mongdang Mountain, from now on, destiny is no different. Behind these myths, what really turns the gears of history is neither romantic nor full of social distress. Economic factors play a major role. From the end of the War of Independence in 1783 to 1789, when George Washington was elected the first president of the United States, America went through a period without a president and almost no national government. According to some liberals, this period of no government should be the golden age of America. However, in practice, Americans were quickly abandoned and started seeking to establish a strong central government. In January 1787, the Massachusetts Armory was attacked by rebels. Rebel leader Daniel Shays was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, who once served in the Continental Army under George Washington as a company commander. However, when he took off his military uniform and returned to his hometown in Massachusetts, he found his family had already incurred unrepayable debts. In fact, many local veterans encountered a similar situation. Originally, they received a stipend for the duration of their service to pay off debt. But during the war, the United States borrowed a lot of debt from domestic business people and foreign governments, unable to pay veterans. These veterans, who had been fighting for national independence, found their families facing bankruptcy. And it got even worse. The Massachusetts government imposed additional property taxes to pay off debts owed to merchants. As a result, local farmers found that it was originally to avoid paying taxes to the British government. They started the war, but after the war was won, the tax on themselves was even heavier. Cornered, Shays played him in the Continental Army. The only thing to learn is to fight. Shays contacted the local veterans and bankrupt farmers, forming a militia to fight taxes, and asked the government to implement debt relief. However, the government forgiving farmers' debts would harm the interests of wealthy business people, and the governor was one of them. holding the government in hand, about £3,000 in IOUs. Boudin united with 125 local wealthy business people, called up about 3,000 soldiers, and strongly suppressed Shays' rebellion. However, this unsuccessful peasant uprising sounded the alarm for the wealthy merchants and landlords of America. At that time, the United States did not have a typical national government. The only body representing the United States was the Continental Congress, with very limited power. For example, on the issue of recruiting troops and taxation, Continental Congress required a formal application to the Weekly Council. It could and often refused its requests. Continental Congress did not have a separate executive branch. Most of the power in the country was in the hands of the state governments. Or rather, America at this time was only a government alliance. The so-called leader was only responsible for convening and managing meetings on the agenda. The officials appointed by the Continental Congress also lacked authority, as their decisions did not represent the will of the country and were often overturned by states. In 1784, the Continental Congress appointed Adams as the United States ambassador to London, responsible for resolving diplomatic disputes with the UK. But Adams made no progress in the UK, as London had never understood what it represented. The whole country was still 13 different states. Throughout the 1780s, the British government also refused to provide assistance to the United States or send an ambassador. Of course, these were only secondary factors. What really drove the American business class was the desire to establish a centralized government. The most pressing reason was the debt problem. The hysterical uprising in Massachusetts made the wealthy merchants and landowners feel a crisis firsthand. They fought during the Revolutionary War, borrowing a lot of debt to the Continental Congress. However, after the war ended, the Continental Congress was deeply indebted at home and abroad, unable to pay at all. With no right to tax, the only recourse was the state government. State governments, on the one hand, also had their own debt problem. On the other hand, due to the loss of internal power in the British imperial system, there were years of depression. Inability to support the central government, crisis of non-recovery, deeply stimulated the American elite. Shays' uprising made them feel the safety threat of their concubine. At the end of the armed war, out of instinct to pay taxes to the British government, they hated the rich merchants and Democrats of the colonies, fantasizing about an unregulated, beautiful country without taxation. However, only 6 years passed before they completely changed their mind. To the feeble and incompetent central government, they expressed extreme dissatisfaction and asked for a rewrite of the rules, to build a new government that makes a difference. This requirement gave birth to another major event in American history: Constitutional Convention. In early 1787, news of Shays' Rebellion spread throughout the country. George Washington was very anxious and decided to answer the call of the big governmentalists, going to Philadelphia, participate in the Constitutional Convention. The reason Washington was so anxious was because he never stopped seeing a greater threat in the uprising. Actually, as early as 4 years ago, officers of the Continental Army planned a higher-level rebellion. On March 10, 1783, Continental Army stationed at Newburgh called a meeting of officers. Major John Armstrong made a rather provocative speech, asking Congress to pay the military according to the agreement and issuing threats. If Congress refused, there would be a military takeover and even a military government. This Major John Armstrong was an adjutant to General Gates during the War of Independence, as famous as Washington. Washington, hearing the news, appeared 5 days later at the second officer meeting, earnestly pleading with the officers to abandon the coup plan. It was precisely because of such a military coup that Washington's response to Shays' Rebellion was much more sensitive. The ambitions of senior officers could be reignited by the restless underbelly brewing a bigger crisis. At the same time, many segments of American society also requested a strong national government from different aspects. Merchants and guilds in major towns hoped for a unified business policy instead of 13 states with different criminal regulations. Land investors and large investors hoped for a strong army to eliminate the Indian threat on the western border. Securities investors and big capitalists hoped the government could act in the name of the country, providing credit guarantees and protecting their assets from threats. These demands were scattered across various groups of society, not building up enough force. But when news of Shays' Rebellion spread, it touched the nerves of the big capitalists. The actions of the upper elites soon prompted a national conference. In May 1787, the Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia's Parliament Hall. Except for Rhode Island, 55 delegates from 12 states attended the conference. Their average age was only 44. For such a task, they looked very young. However, according to the standards of American society at that time, they were all well educated, most coming from the big bourgeoisie in the country. In this sense, Constitutional Convention of the United States was much like a modern version of an ancient Roman aristocratic meeting. The issues of concern to delegates were very similar to the nobility of ancient Rome. One representative suggested that the theme of the meeting was how to deal with the instability and ignorance brought about by democracy. In more colloquial terms, delegates felt that American politics was a little too democratic and should try to control the impulses of ignorant people, establishing a more stable order. Apparently, the delegates came to the same unanimous conclusion as the former Roman nobles. Belief that democracy is excessive becomes populism, and Shays became the first populist on record in American history. After 4 months of discussions, a standby, thick aristocracy with democratic colors was established. It stipulated that power rested with the people, and people elected representatives to perform. Representatives elect another small group to form the government and exercise executive power. Although the executive power still comes from the people, it is a layer of filtering, moderating. Under this system, the vast majority of government officials were elected by fewer people, as the people had not had a chance to elect them in the first place. In fact, the entire Constitution was built on distrust of democracy. Most of the authors of the Constitution, such as Madison, Hamilton, and even the elder Franklin, were deeply skeptical of democracy. To these founders, democracy was an unproven idea. Even now, centuries later, the debate over democracy has never stopped. It is in this context that we can understand the so-called original intention of the founding of the United States. Founding fathers never saw the original intention as creating a pure democracy, but hoped to create a stable, free, and orderly society.